So in our last video, we went over genetics and the environment, and next we're going to be looking at the cells of the nervous system and how these cells can influence the way we think and behave. First, let's look at a neuron, which are the essential building blocks of the nervous system, because they send messages to different parts of our body, to our brain, in order to process information quickly. And we're going to be labeling this neuron here. First, the cell body, or soma, is the nucleus of the neuron, and this is located in the cell membrane and processes information collected from the dendrites. And these dendrites are small branches that receive information from other neurons. This information is then sent through electrical signals through the axon, which is the nerve fiber that transmits these signals of information with the help of the myelin sheath. And this sheath coats the axon and increases the speed of sending the signal to the terminal buttons, which hold the neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are used to send chemical messages from one neuron to the other. So a neuron collects chemical neurotransmitters from the dendrites, as shown here, which becomes processed in the soma and transforms the chemical message to an electrical message, which travels through the axon with the help of the myelin sheath to the terminal buttons to again produce a chemical message to another neuron. And as you can see here, this photo is a representation of how a neurotransmitter is released into a synapse, which is the space between both of the neurotransmitters. And this binds to receptors of the dendrite of the other neuron. And these neurotransmitters know where to bind to which receptor because they act as a lock and key mechanism. Each specific neurotransmitter fits with a specific receptor. So as the terminal buttons here are housing these neurotransmitters, there's a specific receptor in the dendrite of the other neuron that these neurotransmitters connect to. And before a neuron is able to send a message, it is in its resting state, or the resting potential. And here there are more sodium ions, which are the Na ions here, outside of the neuron cell membrane, while there's more potassium ions represented by the K here, K squares. And these potassium ions are mostly inside the neuron. But in order to send a message from the neurotransmitters that binds to receptors, the neuron needs more sodium ions inside and needs to release those potassium ions outside into outside of the cell membrane. And once this occurs, the neuron is then in the threshold of excitation and is ready to send the message from the axon to the neuron. And when the message is sending, an action potential is made, and a peak action potential occurs, and this signal is all or nothing. This is the equivalent to turning a light switch on or off. It either sends the information through the action potential after it gains enough sodium, or it doesn't. And then once the axon has released the message, it goes into repolarization, because the axon has used up these sodium ions. It's going to go back to the regular state of repolarization in order to do this whole cycle again. And the repolarization occurs because all the sodium ions in the neuron that were used to send that message is now depleted. So it has to gain new sodium ions to return to the threshold of excitation to send a new message to the next neuron. And it may seem like these messages can take a long time, but this process is really quick. For example, I could look at the color, say the color of this, and see that it's automatically yellow. And the neurons from my eyes quickly send information to my brain, indicating that this color is yellow. And these chemical and electrical neurotransmitters affect the way we think and behave. For example, if someone is diagnosed with depression, they may lack dopamine, but people can take medications in order to speed up or block these neurotransmitters. And there are two kinds of medications, agonists, which are the chemicals that mimic a neurotransmitter and therefore places itself in the receptors of those missing neurotransmitters where they should be, and antagonists, which do the opposite and blocks neurotransmitters from binding to the receptors. So going back to our example of lacking dopamine in a person who has depression, an agonist medication will mimic the neurotransmitter that a person lacks in order to keep them stable and not depressed. So these agonists may look like these green dots here, and they mimic the usual neurotransmitter and bind to these receptor sites in order to tell the brain that these neurotransmitters are in place, which influences the flow of dopamine. And then if someone has too much production of a certain neurotransmitter, they could take an antagonist medication that blocks the receptors to keep a person stable. So these might represent these red dots here, where they block the information and block other neurotransmitters if they're too much from entering these receptor sites. And that's the end of this video for the cells of the nervous system. In the next video, we'll be going over the parts of the nervous system.